Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. Hope everyone had a relaxing holiday season and a happy new year. The art world started the new year off pretty quickly with its first major art fair occurring this past week in Singapore, ArtSG. There was so much attention paid to Seoul last year with the emergence of Free Seoul, and now there's been increased focus lately on another emerging art scene in Asia with Singapore. We wanted to learn more about how the inaugural edition of ArtSG went, as well as the overall art scene in Singapore. So in this week's episode, we chat with Vivienne Chow, correspondent at Artnet News. Vivienne has written several articles lately on some of the happenings in Singapore. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Vivienne, it's great having you back on the podcast. How have you been?
Thank you so much for having me back, Adam. It's been great. A very hectic week in Singapore.
I'm sure it has. Well, before we even begin to discuss ArtSG, I wanted to ask you a little bit about Singapore on a broader level. Why are some major auction houses, galleries, and fairs so interested in having a presence in Singapore all of a sudden?
I think we have to look at how there's been a shift in terms of the dynamics across Asia. I think for a long time, mainland China, China basically, has been a major powerhouse in terms of the global art market. It's one of the world's biggest, just next to the US or some. And Hong Kong has been a major trading hub for the global art market. But then the pandemic over the past couple of years, or the COVID restrictions, have really made travel and businesses difficult for a lot of people, especially for people coming from the outside, and even like people within Hong Kong and mainland China. So I think it's just natural for people to explore options elsewhere. So I wouldn't say I wouldn't say people are giving up. Definitely not. I think Hong Kong is still viable, and China is still a huge market regardless. But then if there are other possible opportunities, why not, explore new opportunities elsewhere? Just natural, thinking, looking at it from a perfectly normal business perspective. And so last year, I think we saw the rise of Seoul during the opening of Frieze, and then Singapore also came into the picture. But then Singapore has been around for quite some time already, and we'll get into that. So I think there have been a lot of these narratives being played out of who is going to replace Hong Kong amid all these reasons. But then the narrative should be how many more of these major markets can Asia have, or should Asia have, because the market has been expanding, and there's no reason why there cannot be more regional hubs in Asia. I mean, in the US, you wouldn't be having like an either or discussion about New York or LA. Am I correct? So if that's the case, then why can't it be possible to have like Hong Kong, Seoul, and Singapore? Because they serve different purposes, they serve different audiences.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned Seoul, which is another really exciting emerging art scene in Asia that's received a lot of attention lately, as Frieze, the art fair, chose to have their Asian fair in Seoul. Especially for our listeners who haven't visited Singapore or Seoul, how would you compare these cities and the art scenes there?
They are very different, and I think they are equally fascinating. And if there will be a chance, I highly encourage people to visit. And the food are great. for both
I'm sure it is.
both places. I think Korea itself is already, I mean, Korea is a country with a sizable population, and it has really fascinating history that people have forgotten about. I think people now know about like K-pop and like Squid Game and shows like on Netflix, but Korea has this really fascinating history, and actually its contemporary culture is unpacking and addressing these issues. So I think Korea itself is already a very solid. It is a solid market, a solid local market. It has a lot of great local artists, culture practitioners. And Singapore, on the other hand, Singapore is much smaller in terms of the size of the population. It's smaller than Hong Kong. But then when you look at Singapore, I think it's not just about looking at just one city state, but the entire region, that's as in Southeast Asia or the ASEAN states, which has, I think, 10 member states. And so when you're talking about Singapore, we should also include Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, or even Vietnam. So there's so much to see, and I think Singapore is where all these different threads of narratives meet, because Singapore is the closest hub to these places, also including the Philippines. Is also a very distinctive place. So I think Singapore actually is much more. I think you can view it as much more complicated than Korea, because Korea is just one thing, like one entity. But then if you talk about Southeast Asia, you're talking about like 5, 10, different, so many different cultures and religions, and ethnic groups. So it's a lot. There's a lot to see, and I think there's also a growing number of younger collectors who are interested in assembling a meaningful art collection. So I highly recommend people to go and visit.
And so we just had the inaugural edition of the new art fair in Singapore, ArtSG. What was the anticipation like leading up to the fair, and ultimately how did it go?
So the anticipation for ArtSG has been around for quite some time. And I think especially after its first announcement a few years ago. And unfortunately, because of all sorts of number of reasons and COVID, so it's been postponed for 4 times. So I think after the cancellation of our stage in 2019, a lot of people would, have been questioning if Singapore can really be a key market hub in the region, and if it cannot sustain ArtSG or ArtSG if it cannot sustain our stage, then of course like our stage had this problem, and we're not going to go into that in this episode. So I think people in the region, they have already been hoping to have a fair that represents the I think the best from the region, and a fair that also brings in international galleries and participants, and an international crowd to the region, because that's what's been lacking in the past years. So anticipation has been high, and especially RSG is created by this very same crew that produced ArtHK, that was launched in 2008, and Hong Kong art market took off a lot of it. I would say, owes to the beginning of this art fair, RHK, because it was later sold to MCH and then it became Art Basel Hong Kong. So will the same story happen again in Singapore? We don't know, but people have high hopes for Art SG. And I think judging from the opening day, it was quite the sentiment was good. I think people were generally quite excited, especially I think this is the first like real major event in Asia after COVID restrictions have been relaxed, because you saw a lot of people from Hong Kong and a lot of people from mainland China, and then there are also people from Taiwan, also Japan and South Korea. So I think it's the first major gathering of all these people from the art world in Asia, and so people were obviously very excited.
Yeah, it sounds like it. It's incredible how many years lapsed before the fair actually occurred. I'd love to ask you a few more questions about Singapore and the scene there. What's the collecting scene like in Singapore? Can you share some of the collecting trends there with us?
My understanding is that Southeast Asia has been a major region for is been a home for a lot of collectors, and that we can see from especially when I talk to some of the auction houses, like when they have told me that buyers or collectors from Southeast Asia, they have been playing a major role in the art sales at auctions. And we also know is a known fact that there are quite a number of deep-pocketed collectors based in Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand. Thailand is a growing scene that everyone was talking to me. Everyone was telling me about Thailand actually, and also I think the Philippines as well. So but then from my understanding is a lot of them tend to start with works that are culturally closer to them, which means they might focus more on art and artists from their home countries and the region, and venturing into acquiring international art has been a relatively recent thing to a number of people, and based on my conversation with different people.
And so, as more galleries, auction houses, and even other art related businesses continue to look to Asia and specifically Singapore to have a potential presence, what would you identify as some of the challenges or obstacles that they should be aware of?
I think one thing that people talked about in while I was in Singapore is the tax. I think across Asia, Hong Kong is the only place that is tax-free. I think there's a certain amount of a certain amount of tax-free for artworks up to a certain amount of money in Korea. They have Korea has definitely made art buying much more accessible, and made it much easier for people, so that people are buying art instead of buying properties, which I have written about previously. But then in the case of Singapore, they have the GST. And that was interesting. When I checked into the hotel, I there was this huge on the screen, on the TV screen in the hotel room. That was the first thing that they informed the hotel guest, was that the GST has been raised from 7% to 8% from January 1st, 2023 onwards. And then people told me, I haven't verified that, but people told me that this GST is going to increase further next year. In 2024. Well, but at least they told you, so you know what to expect. I think the cost is definitely one issue for Singapore, because things are getting more and more expensive, and that's from the conversation that I had with people living in Singapore. So the cost of living is high, and rent is high, and obviously that has a lot to do with the influx of wealth from Hong Kong, mainland China, and many parts of the world. And all of a sudden, you have like hundreds of family offices set up in Singapore, and we're talking about millions and millions of dollars. And so with that, I think taking the cost into account is one issue. And I think also it is going through a conversion process, because I think, first of all, art buying is still a relatively niche thing, and collecting it takes a long time to develop both the knowledge and your interest. So I think there's a lot of groundwork to do, and a lot of people tend to keep things quite quiet, so they won't tell you what they have bought or if they have bought something. So it's a conversion process, and also how much of that new arrival, those new incoming wealth, how much of that is going to be translated into art buying capital? That's also wait to be seen.
Well, it's fascinating to hear about some of these potential issues, but also really just following the trends and what's developing in Singapore as a art hub in Asia. We're looking forward to following over the next several years to see how the collector base and the market there matures. Vivienne, thanks so much again for coming on the podcast and helping us recap Art SG, as well as share your insights on Singapore. Really appreciate it. And if our listeners don't already, they should definitely check out your articles in Artnet News. And you're also on social media, often talking about the art markets. Where can we find you there?
I can be reached via my Instagram, Miss Vivienne Chow. I'm also available on Twitter, Vivienne Chow.
Perfect. Thanks so much again, Vivienne.
Thank you.